Someone stuffed a 2-month-old golden retriever puppy into a plastic bag and left it to freeze by the roadside like garbage. It was still breathing when they found it, barely. We don't know who did this, yet. But if you believe this monster needs to be exposed, if you believe this innocent life deserves justice, then comment yes right now, because the investigation starts with you. The wind had teeth that morning. It bit through the narrow alleyways of Rochester, New York, sweeping powdery snow across empty streets and curling frost along the edges of dumpsters and mailboxes. At 6:17 a.m., the sun was still a shy bruise behind the clouds, and most of the city lay in frozen silence. But for Grace Simmons, sleep had long since abandoned her. Grace was a 66-year-old woman with a spine that had once held up ballet shoes and protest signs, now slightly stooped from years of grieving. Her pale silver hair was usually tied in a low bun, though today it spilled untamed beneath the hood of her wool coat. Her fingers were thin and red from cold, her breath fogging in front of her like ghosts. She walked every morning, doctor's orders after the minor stroke last fall, but the real reason was that being still made her remember. Her daughter, Annie, had died 7 winters ago in a car crash 2 blocks from here, and Grace had never quite figured out how to unlive that moment. She paused as she reached the corner of Sycamore Street and Marston Lane. Something caught her eye, a crumpled black plastic bag, torn along one edge, lying awkwardly beside a green garbage bin. Normally she wouldn't have looked twice, but something about how the bag shifted slightly, as if reacting to her presence, pulled her forward. She took one cautious step, then another. The bag trembled, her breath caught. Kneeling slowly, she reached out and peeled the plastic aside. What she saw made her recoil so sharply that her knees scraped the icy pavement. Inside the bag was a puppy. Its fur, a dirty gold, was soaked and matted with slush and something darker, mud or worse. The tiny body was curled into itself, limbs stiffened unnaturally, ears slick with ice. Frost clung to its whiskers, and its eyelids were crusted shut. But as Grace leaned closer, the puppy let out the faintest of sounds. A whimper. So soft it could have been the wind. "Oh, dear God," she gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Her other hand reached forward instinctively, almost maternally, and cradled the frozen shape against her chest. It was hard, rigid from cold, but she felt it, the slow, rattling beat of a struggling heart. She stood, clutching the bundle tightly, and fumbled for her phone. Her hands were shaking too much to dial properly, so she screamed into the empty street, her voice cracking. "Somebody help! Help! Please!" That's when the front door of a nearby bakery opened, and a young woman poked her head out, startled. Within minutes, the police were called. The officer who arrived first was Jake Nolan. He stepped out of his patrol car with a speed and focus that only people who've seen too much cruelty tend to carry. Jake was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, with short dark hair and a thick, worn leather jacket that had survived more winters than most people's cars. A faint scar curved under his left eye, the remnant of a fight years ago that had ended a friendship and began his drinking habit. Now under control, but only just. He had a soft spot for cases involving animals, though he rarely said so aloud. People disappointed him too often. Dogs didn't. He approached Grace, who was standing frozen near the curb, still holding the trembling pup like a fragile relic. "I'm Officer Nolan," he said gently. "You found the dog?" Grace nodded, lips pressed tight. "I didn't think it was alive, but it made a sound." Jake looked down at the puppy, his jaw tightening. "We need to get it warm. Now." He took the bundle carefully from her arms, wrapped it in the emergency blanket he kept in his trunk, and radioed for an emergency vet contact. The vet on call was already open a few blocks away, a small clinic that normally took in shelter animals. They rushed the pup in, where the young woman behind the desk shouted for help and vanished behind double doors. Jake filled out the incident report, asking Grace questions through chattering teeth. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Grace Simmons," she said. "I live around the corner. She paused, eyes glassy. "I couldn't leave it." "No one should have," Jake muttered. An hour passed. The snow kept falling, lightly now, almost gently, like the sky had second thoughts. A nurse finally emerged. "He's alive," she said, sounding almost surprised. "Barely. But we've got him on fluids. His core temp was dangerously low. It's going to be a while before we know anything." "He?" Grace asked. The nurse nodded. "A boy, about 2 months old. Golden retriever, we think. He's got a long road ahead." Grace looked at Jake, then at the nurse. Does he have a name?" "Not yet," the nurse smiled. "You found him? You want to choose one?" Grace swallowed hard. "Finn," she said softly. "His name is Finn." The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and damp fur, and the hum of the old wall heater did little to soften the sterile cold that clung to every surface. It was well past midnight, yet Zoe Brennan stood wide awake under the fluorescent ceiling, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the IV tube attached to the tiny, shivering body on the metal table. The puppy, barely 2 months old, lay motionless except for the weak rise and fall of his side. Finn. His name was Finn now. She whispered it once under her breath, as if saying it out loud would anchor him to life. Zoe was 29, slender and tall, with narrow shoulders that seemed more used to bracing against inner battles than physical weight. Her auburn hair was tied up in a messy bun, strands falling loose around a freckled face that looked younger than it should, considering all it had seen. Her gray eyes were sharp but tired, ringed with the dull shadows of many sleepless nights. She had graduated top of her class at Cornell, but had only been practicing in the field for less than a year. And already she carried the memory of a patient she couldn't save, a beagle named Scout, who had died during her final week of internship. The guilt hadn't left her since, and tonight it clung to her again like a second skin. The pup's temperature had risen by 2 degrees in the last hour. That was good, but his heart rate was still erratic, and more troubling. There was something in his blood work that didn't sit right. She had drawn a small sample earlier, and now stood over the microscope, studying the cells with a grim set to her jaw. Elevated white blood cells, minor liver distress, and something else. Traces of a toxin she couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't antifreeze or rat poison, it was something subtler. Maybe ingested, maybe injected. She turned back to the exam table and leaned down gently, brushing the soft matted fur behind Finn's ear. That's when she saw it. A small, near-invisible puncture just below the skin, at the junction between the neck and shoulder, a needle mark. Tiny, deliberate. Her mouth went dry. "You poor little guy," she murmured. "What the hell did they do to you?" Out in the small waiting area, Grace sat slumped in a stiff chair, wrapped in a woolen blanket one of the nurses had given her. Her eyes hadn't closed once. She didn't ask many questions, just sat, unmoving, occasionally sipping water and watching the hallway with the fixed patience of someone who'd waited for worse things before. The storm had tapered to a slow fall now, snow hushing the windows like a lullaby that refused to soothe. Jake Nolan re-entered the clinic just before 2 a.m. His boots thudded quietly against the tile as he carried 2 coffees, one of which he handed to Grace. She blinked at him, then gave a quiet, "Thank you," that barely reached above a whisper. Jake had spent the last hour circling the immediate blocks, following up with dispatch and reviewing possible footage from nearby businesses. Most were either too far, too angled, or snow-covered. But one gas station camera, just across Marston Lane, should have caught the street corner, if it hadn't been shattered. Not weather damage, it was deliberate. And recent. He rubbed his jaw, the stubble scratching against his glove. "Someone didn't want to be seen," he muttered. Grace looked up. "What kind of person does that to a puppy?" Jake didn't answer. Back in the examination room, Zoe prepared a gentle sedative to help Finn rest. The puppy whimpered faintly when the needle approached, but didn't resist. His body had no strength left for resistance. His fur, though partially cleaned, still held the foul smell of rot and mold. The splotches of bruising along his belly were clearer now, greenish-purple patches suggesting blunt force trauma from days before. She documented everything. Photos, vitals, notes. Later, she'd submit them with the formal cruelty report. Her assistant that night, Paul, an older vet tech with thinning gray hair and an easy sarcasm, peeked into the room. "Still fighting?" he asked, eyes darting to the frail body on the table. "Barely," Zoe replied. Paul stepped in and stood beside her, crossing his arms. "Want me to stay longer?" She shook her head. "You've done enough. Go home, get warm." He lingered a moment before patting her shoulder and leaving with a sigh. He didn't have the heart to tell her how many times he'd seen pups like this not make it. Alone again, Zoe sat beside Finn and rested her hand near his paw, letting him feel the warmth. It wasn't professional, but she didn't care. The sterile rules hadn't saved Scout. Maybe something more human would save Finn. As the night deepened and the hallway lights dimmed, Jake sat with Grace, slowly piecing together possibilities in his notepad. There were no missing pet reports filed matching Finn's description. No neighbors had called about barking or suspected abuse. Too clean, too fast. He'd seen this before, not with dogs, but with contraband, with victims who were never meant to be found. This puppy wasn't just abandoned, he was discarded. With intent. He made a note to pull Travis Morton's file first thing in the morning, an old name from an old case. Something about a history with pit bulls and backyard training. Might be nothing. But maybe not. By 5:30 a.m., the sky outside lightened to a bruised pink. Finn's breathing had steadied. The temperature had normalized. Not perfect, but no longer plummeting. Zoe emerged into the waiting area, her scrubs wrinkled, eyes red-rimmed, but calm. Grace stood quickly. He's alive, Zoe said. He made it through the night. Jake exhaled. Grace nearly collapsed into the chair again. But, Zoe added, he was drugged. There's a puncture near the neck and evidence of some kind of toxin. I can't say what yet, but it wasn't an accident. Jake nodded grimly. That confirms what I found. A nearby camera was destroyed. Someone wanted this dog gone and wanted to make sure no one knew who did it. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She looked toward the hallway. Can I see him? Zoe hesitated, then gave a small smile. Just for a minute. She led Grace down the hallway, where Finn lay bundled in a heated pad, an oxygen line gently looped near his nose. His body was still, but his ears twitched slightly at the sound of approaching footsteps. Grace knelt beside him and whispered, "You're not alone anymore, little one." Jake remained outside the room, watching through the small glass panel in the door. His jaw tightened, then relaxed. There was work to do. Someone had left a puppy to die in a plastic bag. He intended to make sure they regretted it. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained, dense, sharp, and lingering like a warning in the wind. By morning, Rochester was veiled in a soft crust of frost. Jake Nolan adjusted the collar of his jacket as he moved door to door in the Sycamore neighborhood, following up on any possible private security systems that might have caught footage near the garbage bins where the puppy had been found. He'd been to 6 homes already. Most had cameras pointed too far inward toward driveways or garages. But at 103 Marston Lane, an elderly woman named Mrs. Rafferty mentioned her son had installed a motion-triggered system for her over the summer. Jake followed her inside. The home was dimly lit, cluttered with framed photos and a peculiar smell of old lavender. Her son had left detailed instructions for accessing the footage, and within minutes, Jake was scrolling through grainy black and white frames from 3 o'clock to 5 a.m. the morning prior. At precisely 4:11 a.m., a figure appeared. The quality was poor, obscured by fog and a glitching lens, but the person was clearly male, tall, wiry, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low. He moved quickly, glancing around before crouching beside the bin and placing the bag down. He lingered for a beat, then darted off. The timestamp aligned perfectly. Jake leaned closer. On the man's right hand, briefly visible under the sleeve as he set down the bag, was a tattoo. A single, thick-lined spade. Jake's eyes narrowed. That symbol scratched at something in the back of his mind. A file. A case. He copied the footage onto a flash drive, thanked Mrs. Rafferty, and stepped back into the cold. Across the street, Grace Simmons was walking slowly along the sidewalk, her coat buttoned high and her scarf tucked into her collar. She wasn't headed anywhere in particular, just restless. The events of the last 24 hours had shaken something loose in her. She'd lived quietly since Annie's death, only speaking to neighbors when needed, only shopping on Tuesdays, only listening to old symphonies while folding laundry, but now everything felt louder. As she passed the low-iron gate of the brick duplex at number 18, she noticed a boy sitting on the stoop, elbows on knees, chin in his palms. He looked no older than 12, bundled in a puffer jacket too big for his frame, his sneakers untied and soaked. "You're Elliot, aren't you?" Grace asked gently, stopping a few feet away. The boy looked up, startled. He had a pale, thin face, a mop of uncombed brown hair, and freckles clustered beneath his eyes. His gaze darted to the door behind him, then back to Grace. He gave a short nod. "I've seen you riding your bike near the market," she continued. "You were always feeding that orange tabby behind the deli." Elliot's lips twitched, as if uncertain whether to smile. "Yeah, that cat's gone now." Grace took a breath. "You heard what happened to the puppy?" His eyes flickered. He looked at his knees. "I heard people talking." Grace crouched beside him, careful not to seem forceful. "Did you hear anything before that? Or see anything strange?" The boy hesitated, glancing again at the door. "I heard crying, not people, a dog. It was coming from the house next to mine, number 14. I heard it for like 2 nights. Loud, screaming kind of sound." Grace's stomach clenched. "Did you tell anyone?" He shook his head. "My stepdad said not to get involved in people's business. Said if I keep sticking my nose where it don't belong, I'd be next." Grace frowned. "Is he home now?" Elliot didn't answer. She noticed a fading bruise near his jawline, hastily covered with the edge of his collar. She didn't push further. "Thank you for telling me," she said instead. "Would you mind if I came by again sometime, just to talk?" Elliot nodded faintly. Grace stood and crossed the street, her mind racing. At the corner, she ran into Jake, who was just returning from the footage collection. He noticed her expression immediately. "Something wrong?" "There's a boy, Elliot, 12. Said he heard dogs crying at number 14, and that his stepfather warned him to stay quiet." Jake's jaw set. 14? "Yes." Jake's eyes darkened. "That house belongs to Travis Morton." Grace tilted her head. "You know him?" Jake nodded slowly. "He was arrested 7 years ago for operating a dog-fighting ring out of a warehouse. Claimed he was only a spectator. Charges didn't stick. Lack of evidence. He's been under the radar since, but that tattoo..." He pulled out the flash drive and showed Grace a still image from the footage. "Look at the hand. Spade symbol. Travis had one just like it, branded when he was part of a prison crew in Attica." Grace exhaled. "Do you think it's him?" "I think we'll need more than speculation." That afternoon, Jake filed for a quiet background check. Travis Morton, now 32, lived alone at number 14. No known employment, no social media. 2 noise complaints from neighbors within the last month, both unresolved. Jake requested city sanitation logs, hoping to track where the same type of trash bag had come from. He also contacted animal control to review previous anonymous reports in the area. Meanwhile, Grace returned to the clinic to check on Finn. Zoe met her in the lobby. The vet had traded her scrubs for a chunky knit cardigan and jeans, her hair damp from a quick shower upstairs. She looked better, still tired, but lighter. "He's stable," Zoe said. "No fever, still weak, but responsive. He wagged his tail this morning when he smelled food." Grace smiled, relief washing over her. "I'd like to keep him here another night," Zoe continued. "Monitor the liver enzymes. But I think he's going to pull through." As Grace stood by the recovery crate, watching Finn sleep under his blanket of heated fleece, she thought of Elliot, of the bruise, of the fear behind his eyes. She knew what it was like to carry silence. She had done it for years after Annie's death, convinced she could live without speaking of grief, of memory. But silence had teeth, and now so did truth. The warrant came through at 10:47 a.m., crisp and official, with the judge's signature still drying in blue ink. Jake Nolan tucked the folder into his coat, tightened the scarf around his neck, and headed toward the 1-story brick home at 14 Marston Lane. The house had the tired look of a place that had seen more secrets than sunlight. Blinds permanently drawn, the front porch littered with unopened mail, and paint peeling around the doorframe like shedding skin. Travis Morton answered after 3 firm knocks. He was 32, but looked older, gaunt, with skin the color of dried ash, and hollow cheeks shadowed by a few days of uneven stubble. His hair was buzzed close to the scalp, revealing the spade tattoo etched into the ridge of his right hand. His eyes, small and set deep, lacked expression. They were the kind that blinked slow, like nothing ever surprised them. He stood barefoot in sweatpants and a white thermal shirt that clung to his wiry frame. "You got a warrant?" he asked calmly. Jake held it up. "I do." Travis stared at him for a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Call my lawyer," he muttered, turning into the house. Inside, the place was claustrophobic. The air smelled of bleach and old smoke. Plastic sheeting covered parts of the living room floor. A window was cracked open despite the cold, and two space heaters buzzed noisily in the corners. Jake moved carefully, documenting everything with his body camera, while another officer, Carla Reyes, a short, stocky woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense gait, joined him with a clipboard and gloves. Carla was known for being thorough, and she had no patience for liars. They moved room by room. There were no cages, no obvious evidence of animals. But out back, behind the detached garage, Jake spotted a half-open bin. Inside were shreds of torn fabric, dog food wrappers, and clumps of light-colored fur. Golden, brittle, and unmistakably from a long-haired breed. Jake bagged it immediately, noting the proximity to a scorched patch of grass, where something had clearly been burned. Travis said nothing, standing in the doorway with a lawyer beside him, a woman named Meredith Chu, early 30s, sharp black blazer, hair tied in a tight bun, every word measured like a metronome. She didn't let Travis speak directly. "My client denies any connection to the animal you're referring to," she said. "No pet registered at this address. No prior incident." Jake showed her the photo of Finn. "This puppy was found 2 blocks from here, in a bag, wrapped and left to freeze. We have camera footage showing someone matching your client's build and tattoo dropping the bag." Meredith's lips didn't twitch. "Footage without facial ID is speculative. You have no direct link." Jake paused, then pulled out a receipt printed on thin thermal paper, retrieved that morning from a corner store 2 blocks down. "Unless you count this." Travis Morton purchased a box of those exact garbage bags, dated 2 days before the drop. Travis still didn't flinch. "Everyone buys garbage bags," he said flatly, "but not everyone leaves a puppy to die in them." There was no confession. No slip. Just the same pale, unreadable mask. But Jake walked away from that house with the evidence bag and a knot in his chest. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was closer. Back at the clinic, Zoe Brennan was crouched beside Finn's crate, a bowl of softened oatmeal and broth in her hand. The puppy, still fragile and slow-moving, had lifted his head an inch. His eyes were open now, murky brown and uncertain. When he sniffed the bowl and licked tentatively at the edge, Zoe's shoulders dropped like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Finn's fur was cleaner now, though patches were still tangled or missing entirely. Zoe had spent the night gently trimming away necrotic bits, applying balms, and whispering comfort even when she wasn't sure he could hear her. This morning, for the first time, his tail had twitched, a faint wag, like the ghost of trust returning. Zoe couldn't hold it in. She stepped away, covered her face with her hands, and cried, quiet, exhausted sobs that came in waves. Paul, the vet tech, found her a few minutes later and said nothing. Just placed a cup of hot tea near her and squeezed her shoulder. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived again, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes tired but glowing when she saw Finn awake. She walked slowly toward the crate, crouched down and whispered, "Hi there, baby. You're still here?" Finn blinked at her, ears twitching. Then, for the first time, his eyes focused, directly on her. He shifted slightly, weak legs pressing into the bedding. Grace reached through the bars, and his nose found her fingers. A tremble ran through his small body. Then a light, trembling wag of his tail brushed the floor. "He remembers," Zoe said quietly from behind her. "He knows who saved him." Grace smiled, tears shining but unshed. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "You saved yourself. I just helped." But Zoe wasn't smiling. Her gaze had locked on something beneath Finn's belly. She stepped forward carefully, knelt down, and gently adjusted the puppy's position. On the lower side of his abdomen was a small circular scar, barely wider than a pencil eraser. The skin around it was smooth, unnatural. She'd missed it during the emergency cleanup. "What's this?" Grace asked. Zoe touched it with gloved fingers. "It's a burn scar. Too round to be from a surface. More like heat from a focused source." "Like a lighter?" Grace guessed. "Too wide. I've seen this before," Zoe said. "Some people use plastic welders or hot glue guns as punishment. It cauterizes without bleeding, leaves that exact shape." Grace recoiled slightly. Someone branded him. Someone wanted to hurt him and make sure it stayed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Finn whimpered softly, curling closer to the warmth of his bedding. Grace reached in and stroked behind his ear. "It's over now," she said gently. "It's going to be over." Back at the precinct, Jake sat in front of his computer, reviewing the forensics on the fur sample. Preliminary results matched it as consistent with golden retriever DNA. Not definitive, but highly suggestive. He rubbed his temples, remembering Travis's cold stare, the scorched grass, the missing link that still kept this from being airtight. It wasn't over yet, but they were getting closer. The sky hung low and metallic the next morning, threatening sleet that never quite came. Rochester moved with the weight of winter still pressing into its spine, and Grace Simmons moved through it like a ghost with purpose. She knocked on Elliot's door at 8 a.m. sharp, balancing a small paper bag of blueberry muffins in her hand. No one answered. She waited 5 minutes, then 10. At last, the door creaked open just a few inches. Elliot's face appeared, pale and cautious. His eyes darted behind her, then back to the floor. "Hi," Grace said gently. "I brought you something." He didn't respond. His lip looked swollen, and a faint scrape traced across his left cheekbone. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. "Is he home?" Elliot nodded once. "I won't stay," she said. "But if you need anything, I live just 2 houses down." She reached into her coat pocket and pressed a folded slip of paper into his palm. "You don't have to call. Just knock." She turned to leave. "Wait," Elliot whispered. His hand dipped into his hoodie pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in a piece of an old napkin. "I found this yesterday." She took it carefully, unwrapping it with trembling fingers. Inside was a red nylon dog collar, frayed at the edges and caked with dried dirt. The name Buddy was engraved on a faded metal tag, scratched and dulled with age. She stared at it in stunned silence. "I think it was his," Elliot murmured. "The puppy. He was out back sometimes, before he disappeared," Grace finished for him. Elliot nodded again. "I used to sneak food to him. He was always tied up. He had this collar. Then one day he wasn't there anymore. My stepdad said Travis got rid of it." "Did you tell anyone?" "No one listens to me." Grace knelt, eye level now. "I'm listening, and Jake will too." Elliot hesitated, then whispered, "You shouldn't trust Travis. He does bad things to animals. My stepdad says he's off the radar for a reason." Later that afternoon, Grace brought the collar to Jake. He sat in his precinct office, hunched over a desk cluttered with printed reports, discarded coffee cups, and a city map dotted with red pins. He took the collar, examined it silently, then handed it to forensics with the words, "Check for blood, and DNA if you can pull any." "Where'd this come from?" he asked. "Elliot," Grace said. "He found it behind Travis's garage." Jake leaned back in his chair. "That changes things." Grace folded her arms. "What happens now?" "I bring Travis in again, this time with more pressure." Jake had seen men like Travis before, cold, methodical, emotionless. They didn't break under threat, they broke under exposure. If they knew someone was watching them too closely, they either ran or did something stupid. By the time Travis arrived at the station, escorted by Meredith Chu once again, Jake had already laid out the collar, photo evidence, and the preliminary forensics report. Small traces of canine blood, aged but still detectable, and dog fur consistent with Finn's DNA. Travis glanced at it, expressionless. "Doesn't prove a thing." Jake stood across from him, arms crossed. "A puppy was found nearly dead 2 blocks from your house. A camera shows someone with your tattoo dropping the bag. You bought the same trash bags. Now this collar, with dried blood, is recovered on your property. You want to tell me this is all coincidence?" Meredith interrupted calmly. "There's still no direct evidence linking my client to the abuse." Jake leaned forward. "You're right, but a judge might see a pattern, and if you've got something in that house you forgot to clean up, God help you." Travis's jaw twitched for the first time. When the interrogation ended, Jake returned to his office to find a plain envelope left on his desk. No stamp, no name. Inside was a single sheet of white paper, typed, "Stop digging. Some dogs are meant to die." Jake stared at it for a long moment before folding it into an evidence bag. He didn't flinch. He'd had worse threats. But this wasn't about him. This was about a boy who brought muffins to strangers and whispered truth through bruised lips. About a dog who had never asked to be brave. He called Grace. "Where's Elliot now?" "I don't know," she said. "He didn't answer his door this morning." Jake felt a chill creep over his shoulders that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'll check the house." But by the time he got there, number 18 was locked and silent. He knocked, called, nothing. A neighbor across the street, a wiry man in his 60s named Mr. Langley, stepped out with a cigarette in hand. "You looking for that kid?" Langley asked. "Yes," Jake replied. "You seen him?" "He left this morning, backpack and all. Looked scared. Ran off toward the bus stop. But no bus comes till noon." Jake's gut twisted. Elliot had disappeared. At the clinic, Finn was improving steadily. His appetite had returned, and though he still flinched at sudden sounds or movements, he had started following Zoe's scent around the room with his eyes. When Grace visited, he curled against her foot, a small bundle of warmth and fragile trust. She held the collar in her hand and wept quietly. "Buddy," she whispered. "Your name was Buddy." Zoe stood beside her, watching, and for the first time in a week, she let herself believe. Maybe they weren't too late. But as night fell over the city and the precinct's phones rang without answer, Jake sat in his truck staring out across the snow-dusted street, holding the anonymous threat in his gloved hands. It was no longer just about a dog. The storm rolled in just after sunset, dragging thick, wind-packed snow across the streets of Rochester, like white sheets pulled over a body. The cold was knife-sharp, punishing even through layers, and the silence it brought was unnatural, like the whole city was holding its breath. Grace Simmons stood at her kitchen window, phone clenched in one hand, worry carved into every line of her face. It had been 2 days since Elliot disappeared. No calls, no word. No one at school had seen him, and the police had no leads beyond Jake's gut instinct, that the boy was hiding because it wasn't safe to go home. Grace had a feeling she knew where he was. The old maintenance shed behind West Marston Elementary had been condemned for years. Tucked between the playground and a line of overgrown hedges, it was mostly forgotten by everyone, except children looking for somewhere to hide. She had passed it once with Annie years ago, when her daughter was still in elementary school, still alive, still running with scraped knees and ponytails. The memory made her stomach twist. She pulled on her coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and headed into the snow. 10 minutes later, her flashlight's beam cut across the half-buried structure, its slanted roof weighed down by ice. The padlock was broken, hanging from the latch like a snapped limb. She hesitated, then pushed the door open slowly. "Elliot?" Her voice echoed against wood and rusted metal. Inside, it smelled of mold and damp insulation. "Elliot, it's me. Grace." A soft sound, barely a whimper. She moved the light to the corner. There, curled under an old blanket and hugging a backpack to his chest, was Elliot. He was shivering, his cheeks flushed with cold, his lips cracked. When he saw her, he tried to sit up, then slumped back down. "Don't tell them," he croaked. Grace dropped beside him, wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "I'm not telling anyone anything. I just want you safe." "I didn't mean to make trouble," he whispered. "I just couldn't stay there." "You did the right thing," she murmured. But then, somewhere outside, the air cracked. Not with thunder, not with snow. It was a pop. Then another. A flicker of orange light passed across the slats of the shed window. Grace turned her head. Smoke. She moved faster than she thought she could. Dragged Elliot to his feet, threw the blanket over his shoulders. Outside, the hedges were catching fire, small at first, then faster, brighter, as something chemical took hold. The back corner of the shed already glowed with embers, fed by whatever accelerant had been poured there. This wasn't an accident. Grace slammed through the door into the snow, nearly falling with Elliot's weight against her. She looked back, flames now licking at the walls. Her hands fumbled for her phone, but it slipped. She screamed instead, hoarse and ragged into the night. A car had been idling nearby. Its headlights lit up the edge of the field. From it came Jake Nolan, coat half open, scarf trailing behind him, gun holstered but hand ready. He had been circling the school on a hunch. When he heard the scream, he didn't hesitate. He ran through the rising snow and caught Elliot as the boy collapsed in Grace's arms. Behind them, the shed's walls groaned and cracked, one plank already collapsing inward. Jake threw his jacket around the boy, guided Grace back toward the cruiser. As he helped them in, he looked up. A figure in a hoodie was moving through the trees at the far end of the lot. Just a silhouette, then gone. Jake took 3 steps forward, hand on his weapon, but the figure vanished into the snow. Back at the station, Elliot sat wrapped in 2 blankets, sipping warm apple juice with hands that barely steadied. He looked smaller than ever in the wide, sterile room, his hair damp, his eyes raw from smoke. Jake sat across from him, notebook closed, voice low. "Elliot, you don't have to talk, but if you want to, now's the time." The boy looked at Grace, then nodded. "I saw Travis bring him back. The dog, Buddy. He had him in a cage in his garage. Said he got him from a breeder out past Iron Hollow, someplace no one talks about. But people know it's there. Said the pup was too soft for guard work. Said his girlfriend's kid got bitten when the dog barked too loud, so he beat him." Elliot looked down at the floor. "He tied him up out back for a few nights. I gave him food when I could. He always wore that red collar. Then one day he was gone." Jake asked, "You saw all this yourself?" The boy nodded again. "He called him Buddy." Jake exhaled, slow and careful. Grace reached over and took the boy's hand. "You're brave," she said. "So brave." Later that night, Jake typed the incident report with slow, methodical precision. Elliot's testimony gave them a chain of possession, a connection to the illegal breeder, evidence of abuse. Buddy, now Finn, was no longer just an anonymous victim. He was a witness. Zoe Brennan watched Finn sleep under soft blue light. He twitched gently, chasing dreams he hadn't dared before. The burn mark on his belly was fading, replaced by new fur. But some scars never really vanished. She reached in and touched the collar now resting beside his bed. "Your name's coming back to you," she whispered. Out in the parking lot, Jake leaned against his cruiser, the snow thick on his shoulders. He thought of the figure by the trees, the smell of gasoline, the way fire crawled when it was told where to go. This wasn't just cruelty anymore. It was a warning. The morning the raid was approved, the sun returned to Rochester for the first time in weeks. It didn't warm much, but the sky was a brittle blue, and the snow, though crusted and gray in places, reflected light like glass. Jake Nolan stood outside the precinct, his badge clipped to his chest for the last time, wind tugging at the edges of his coat as he loaded up the trunk of an unmarked van. Beside him stood Officer Carla Reyes, her dark braid tucked beneath a fleece cap, lips set in a firm line. She held the printed satellite maps Jake had marked with red circles. 4 potential kennel structures, all hidden in the dense woods outside Iron Hollow, 20 miles east of the city. Carla had spent 20 years on the force, shorter than Jake, but built like rebar. Her instincts were precise, her attitude low on patience, and after reviewing Elliot's statement and the evidence, she had pushed for a full-scale raid without hesitation. "Ready to shut this down?" she asked, pulling on a Kevlar vest. Jake didn't hesitate. "Ready to end it." By 9 a.m., 2 teams, 8 officers, 1 animal control unit, and a vet team led by Zoe Brennan converged at the dirt trail leading to the property registered under a shell company. Jake recognized the terrain. The path twisted between tall pine trees, overgrown and winding, ending at a barbed wire gate behind which loomed a low, rusted barn. The stench hit them first, the mix of rot, feces, urine, and something darker, something metallic. Inside, they found the cages, rows of them, crates too small for the animals inside. Pups barely older than Buddy had been, whimpering, trembling, their ribs showing through matted fur. Some barked weakly. Others didn't make a sound at all. Zoe moved quickly, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. She opened each cage, gently lifting out the dogs, whispering to them as she passed them to volunteers. One dog, a black and tan spaniel mix, tried to bite at first, then collapsed into her arms as if realizing he no longer needed to fight. Carla found the evidence rooms, collars with names scratched off, ledgers filled with coded transactions, and a hidden freezer with vials of sedatives matching the chemical traces in Buddy's blood work. Jake walked through the barn in silence, hands clenched. This wasn't just cruelty. It was business. Someone had made money from pain. And Travis Morton had been the middleman. He was arrested without incident later that afternoon at a gas station outside the city, trying to board a truck headed for Michigan. No lawyer this time. No cool silence. Just a muttered string of curses as the cuffs locked around his wrists. News broke within hours. Local journalists swarmed the precinct, and before long, national animal advocacy groups picked up the story. Hashtags appeared across social media. #justice, #4buddy, #no more chains, #Finn survived. People donated, people demanded. For once, people cared. 3 days later, the city organized a small press conference outside the Animal Rescue Center, where the recovered dogs were being treated. Grace stood on the small stage wearing a navy coat with silver buttons, her white hair pinned back neatly. In her arms sat Finn, no longer trembling, no longer silent. His fur had begun to shine again, patches still healing, but his eyes alert, ears perked. As the cameras clicked and questions buzzed from reporters, Finn turned toward Grace and, to the amazement of the crowd, placed his paws on her shoulder and pressed his face to her neck. The photo would go viral. Jake stood to the side, dressed in plain clothes, no longer in uniform. His resignation had been approved that morning. He'd been offered a new position by the Northern Wildlife Justice Coalition, a small but fierce nonprofit dedicated to tracking and dismantling animal cruelty networks across state lines. It wouldn't pay much, but it would matter. Grace approached him quietly after the press event. "You sure about this?" He smiled. "Never been more." She looked at him for a long moment. "They'll be lucky to have you." "Just following Finn's lead," he said. "Sometimes survival has a purpose." As the sun began to dip behind the frozen trees, Zoe joined them, her arms dusted with dog fur and her face flushed from triage work. She handed Jake a clipboard filled with intake forms. "We found 42 dogs in total. 17 were puppies. 4 will need long-term therapy, but none died." Jake looked down at Finn, now happily chewing on a stuffed toy shaped like a duck. "They lived," he said, "so we fight for them." Elliot wasn't at the press conference, but he was safe. After the raid, Child Protective Services had removed him from his home. His aunt, Teresa Franklin, a middle school art teacher in Syracuse, had taken emergency custody. Teresa was in her late 40s, with curly red hair, bright green eyes, and a laugh that cracked like sunlight through blinds. She hadn't seen Elliot in 2 years, cut off by family conflict, but the moment she walked into the social worker's office and saw the boy's tired face, she dropped her bag and ran to him. Now, he was enrolled in a new school, with therapy scheduled twice a week and a dog of his own, a mutt with mismatched eyes that Zoe had quietly approved for early adoption. Elliot named her Hope. That evening, Grace signed the final adoption papers for Finn. She sat with Zoe and Jake in the clinic lobby, the forms laid out neatly before her, and wrote Grace Simmons in curling script across the bottom line. Finn rested beside her, one paw over her shoe. "He came from hell," Jake said, watching them. "And now he's home." Outside, snow began to fall again, but this time it was quiet, gentle. No longer hiding screams, but settling over a city where, for once, someone had made it out. The snow had returned to Rochester. Not in blizzards or storms, but in soft waves that blanketed rooftops and painted the sidewalks with quiet grace. It had been a full year since the raid, since the fire, since a puppy in a plastic bag changed the course of several lives. Now, the town breathed slower under the hush of winter. And within the home on Sycamore Street, life was steady and full of warmth. Grace Simmons moved through her small kitchen in thick wool socks, humming under her breath as she stirred a pot of stew. Her hair was shorter now, silver with soft curls, and her cheeks carried more color than they had in years. In the living room, Finn, now nearly 2 years old, lay curled on the braided rug, his head resting atop his paws, golden fur thick and gleaming, the once bare patches fully restored. He had filled out with muscle and confidence, no longer the trembling figure in a crate. He still flinched at sudden noises sometimes, still hated enclosed spaces, but his eyes had changed. They no longer darted from fear, but looked ahead with curiosity and trust. The doorbell rang. Before Grace could respond, Finn was already on his feet, tail wagging in broad sweeps, ears perked. He let out a single sharp bark, not out of alarm, but joy. He recognized the pattern of the footsteps on the porch. Grace opened the door to find Elliot standing there, his coat dusted with snow, cheeks red from the walk. He was 13 now, taller, his frame beginning to shed childhood. He had a new pair of glasses that slid down his nose, and a sketchbook tucked beneath his arm. He grinned as Finn pushed his nose into his hand. "Someone's been eating well," Elliot laughed, kneeling down to let Finn jump against him. "You both have," Grace said with a warm smile. "Come in before your fingers freeze." They gathered in the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Elliot showed Grace a drawing he'd done, charcoal on thick paper, of Finn standing on a hilltop, wind in his fur. The perspective was from behind, but Grace could tell the dog was looking ahead, not back. "You've gotten good," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "My art teacher says I draw like I remember what something felt like," Elliot replied with a shrug. "Not just how it looked." Grace looked at him. "I think that's the best way to remember." On the coffee table sat a framed photo, one taken during the press conference the year before. Finn had his paws on Grace's shoulder, nose buried in her neck, his body pressing into hers like he finally understood he had a home. The image had become iconic, but to Grace, it was simply truth. Finn curled beside Elliot on the floor, nudging his foot every few minutes, as if making sure he was really there. Across town, in a modest office nestled above a co-op bookstore, Jake Nolan leaned back in a creaky wooden chair. His desk was cluttered with case files and advocacy brochures. A large corkboard behind him was pinned with photos, maps, and newspaper clippings, threads of cruelty woven across state lines, now being unraveled one by one. He looked older now, more lined around the eyes, but also lighter somehow. The weight of his badge had been replaced by a different kind of burden, one he chose. He worked with the Northern Wildlife Justice Coalition, traveling, investigating, connecting shelters and law enforcement across regions. It was tiring work, but it felt right. On the corner of his desk sat a photograph in a weathered black frame. It was the first photo taken of Finn, still named Unknown Golden at the time, wrapped in a gray blanket, eyes shut, lips cracked. Beneath it, in his own handwriting, were the words, "Silence is a crime." Jake stared at it for a moment, then pulled out his notebook. A new tip had come in from Pennsylvania, an anonymous call about cages in an abandoned factory. He scribbled down the address. Before he could close the book, his phone buzzed. It was Grace. "Elliot's here," she said. "Finn's thrilled. We're going sledding tomorrow. You should stop by." Jake chuckled. "I'll bring Coco. You bring the bravery." That night, snow fell harder. The world outside turned silver and hushed. In the backyard, Finn sat near the fence, watching the flakes drift down with patient eyes. Grace opened the door, calling his name. And for the first time since he had been found, Finn didn't just walk back. He ran. Through the open gate, across the yard, into the street where the lampposts cast amber halos. He ran like he wasn't afraid anymore, like no hand would strike him, no cage would close. He turned once, looking back at Grace. His eyes sparkled. Then he barked, loud, clear. Not a cry for help, but a call of freedom. Grace didn't call him back. She just watched. He returned minutes later, panting, nose dusted with snow, tail wagging like a flag of survival. Inside, Elliot smiled from the window. "He needed that," he said. Grace nodded. "So did I." The house filled with light, laughter, and stew. The fire burned low and warm, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Finn, Buddy, lay curled on his side, the weight of fear long since melted from his bones.